You are listening to Proof of Love with Tatiana Moroz, Dr. Stephanie Murphy, and Lauren Kasovitz. This show may contain adult content, language, and humor and is intended for mature audiences. If that's not you, please stop listening. Nothing you hear on Proof of Love is intended as financial advice, legal advice, therapy, or really anything other than entertainment. Please take everything that you hear with a grain of salt. Oh, and if you're hearing us on an affiliate network, the ideas and views expressed on this show are not necessarily those of the network that you're listening on, or of any of the sponsors or affiliate products that you may hear about on the show. Now that that's squared away, let's start the show. Show me your heart. I know that it's beating. Tell me that you love me too. So I know your heart is true. 'Cause I need some proof of love. 'Cause I need some proof of love. 'Cause I need some proof of love. Thank you to our sponsor, MetalPay, where you can send money anywhere easily and for free while earning crypto. Use the code Tatiana Show to earn even more. MetalPay.com. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Proof of Love. We're so excited to have you joining us today. We're going to be talking about what I think is one of the most interesting and insightful topics that I've ever learned about when exploring relationships, and that's attachment theory. But first, let's say hi to the girls. We've got Dr. Stephanie Murphy and Lauren Kasovitz here with us. Say hi, ladies.
Hi.
Hey, nice to see everybody, hear everybody.
Oh,
Cool.
yeah,
So
this is going to be an awesome show.
Yeah, we're excited. For those of you who haven't really learned about what Proof of Love is about, feel free to go to our website, proofoflovecast.com, like podcast, but a lovecast. And over there, you can check out some old episodes. You can see a little blog description about us and our different backgrounds and stuff like that. Stephanie's been talking about relationships online since 2008, so over a decade. Lauren's been blogging. I'm just oversharing in my music constantly. So if you want to learn a little bit more about us, make sure you check out the website and say hi to us on Twitter and Facebook and stuff like that.
Awesome. Yeah, let's get started. So what is attachment theory?
I don't know, Stephanie. So, okay, the way that I almost feel like you should explain it to people, but the way that I've understood it is attachment theory is the way that you relate to somebody else. And it's based off of how you were when you were a little baby. So before you even remember, you developed a certain attachment style. And the way that they did it was through an experiment, the way that they discovered it. And basically certain babies, they get really enough love. Some of them don't get enough love. And so if they don't get enough love, they might have different reactions. Do you want to maybe delve into that? Because I don't know if I'm butchering it.
No, absolutely. That's a great way to introduce the concept. So the first person to coin the term attachment theory was John Bowlby. He was a psychologist, and he did some work on this in the late 1960s. And there were other people who also studied attachment theory, like Mary Ainsworth and Cindy Hazen and Philip Shaver. So just trying to give some credit to the scientists who were working on this. But you're right, Tatiana. The idea is that when you're a baby, there are these neural pathways that are formed based on how securely you feel attached to your parents. How much love are your caregivers giving you? And how much can you relax about whether your needs are going to get met? If you have a really strong bond with your parents, and that starts when you're a really little baby by lots of touching and probably like nursing on your mother. And if you cry, are your parents going to come get you right away? Or are they going to like just leave you there and let you cry it out on your own? Do you have your basic needs met when you're hungry, when you cry, or when you're thirsty? Or when your diaper's wet, do they come and actually help you? Or are you constantly in doubt about whether those needs are going to get met for you? That sets up your brain to be wired in a certain way, and it sticks around. That wiring in your brain sticks around until you're an adult. And when you're an adult, it actually shows up in your relationships, because if you never knew about whether you were going to get love or food or whatever when you were a baby, you're going to be really anxious about that in your adult relationships too. You're also going to be anxious about whether you're going to get love, because you're going to be running off that template or pattern that was formed by the way that your parents treated you.
Yeah, and they even actually did an experiment with babies. So from what I recall, they basically put the baby in a room with their mother. And then when the mom would leave the room, the baby would have a certain reaction. And then when the mom came back, the baby would have a certain reaction.
Yes.
So based on that, that's how they kind of categorize you. So do you want to run through the 4 different attachment styles?
Sure. Yeah. There are different categories based on these original studies of attachment theory of people's attachment style. The first one is secure. So a securely attached kid doesn't really freak out when their mother leaves the room. They know that the parent is going to come back and take care of them. So they're pretty chill. They can just play by themselves and entertain themselves for a little while.
And this makes up, just to interject for people to give them a reference, it makes up about 50% of the population. So they give and receive love naturally. If you're in a relationship with them, they don't freak out. They are willing to meet your emotional needs. They're not threatened by that in any way. And then the other 50% of the population is among the screwed. So
Yeah, maybe not so much screwed as just, they're affected by their early experiences, right? And the secure attachment style is kind of the healthy or the normal or ideal one if the baby gets enough love when they're a little kid. But if you're not getting what you need from your parents, you might end up in one of the other categories. One of those is anxious, and anxious people are always when they're a little kid, and the mother leaves the room, like in this original experiment, the kid is just kind of walking around, like maybe crying, maybe feeling, just demonstrating signs of anxiety about when is my mother coming back? When am I going to get my caregiver to come back? And they're really showing signs of stress, physical stress about being separated from their primary caregiver. So that's the anxious style. And then as an adult, that could show up in relationships too, where the person is anxious that their partner is going to leave them, that their partner is going to stop loving them or stop caring about them, or that their partner is going to somehow withdraw affection. And they're always expecting that to happen because that's what happened when they were a kid. Is that right, Tatiana?
Yeah, I would maybe add to that because that's my category. This is the category where you think obsessively about somebody, you think that you're not good enough for them, and it's really, really hard to let go. So when you're threatened, your natural instinct is to hold harder. So a lot of times people who are anxious will need some extra reassurance, but they also can become good partners because they're really sensitive to what's going on. And so they're very empathetic. And it just takes a minute for them to actually feel that security. So it's actually, I think, the most embarrassing of the categories because in our society, being clingy is basically the worst thing that you can possibly be. And, you're expected to just not care. So it's something that I think when I learned about that as a default, I felt a lot better about myself because I just thought I was a crazy person. And about 25% of the population falls under that category. So it's not that weird. And it doesn't mean that you're, doomed or anything like that. In a lot of ways, it actually means that you're capable of more love than some people because you're really available there. But it can also lead you to picking out the wrong person and maybe not letting go as soon as you should for your own benefit, just out of fear.
Yeah, and anxious types can tend to be attracted to the other type, which is avoidant, which we'll talk about in a minute. But first, I want to say, Tatiana, I really appreciate how you pointed out some of the positives of this attachment style, right? And that it doesn't mean that someone is broken. It just means that they have a little bit different way of relating. And they also have the capacity to be a really loving and attentive partner, right? And that this is actually quite common. You're not alone if you have this attachment style. And it's not your fault. It's not something you did wrong. It's just a product of your early experiences.
And I would like to say that maybe it doesn't mean that the parent did something wrong either. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think that all people who have these anxieties or whatever are necessarily, abused children or something.
Sure. I think most parents or all parents do the best that they can, right? No parent wakes up and says, yeah, I just feel like being a shitty parent. I'm not going to try my hardest. No, I think parents love their children and they're trying their best. But, sometimes, sometimes it's not always possible to attend to your child's needs, especially if you're in a stressful situation yourself.
Absolutely. And then the other attachment style, there's one little one that kind of is like about 5% of the population is avoidant. And so in that experiment, the baby would basically, like, the mom would leave the room, and then when the mom would come back to the room, the baby would act like it didn't notice. And it was just kind of surly and just doing its own thing, almost avoiding the mother completely.
Mm-hmm.
But when they did tests, they saw that the baby was just as stressed out as the other baby was. And so it's like, in order to protect themselves, the avoidant, especially as they get older, they desire the interest in being with somebody, but they see it as a threat to their autonomy. And whenever somebody gets close, they kind of run away. So a lot of girls have probably dated this guy a million times.
Yes.
The guy that's emotionally unavailable. He seems like he really, really likes you. And then all of a sudden he goes AWOL and you can't figure out why. And that's a terrible combination, because it almost fulfills the mental expectation of the anxious person that they will be abandoned. And then the avoidant person, even though they say that they don't want that person around, they actually are doing those things in order to drive the other person crazy, because that craziness will assure them that they're actually loved. So it gets really, really messy really quickly. Do you want to add to that, Steph, Laura?
Yeah, I would love to interject just as a secure type. I found that in my experience, it's interesting that anxious people are attracted to avoidance, because I've found that avoidants are often attracted to secure types. And I think that there is a consistency in the secure type that an avoidant sees, whether they recognize that or not. There's an immediate kind of that warm familial bond. And I think that can often drive a lot of secure types to temporarily feel more of the anxious type, because it's very confusing to them. They don't see things the same way. They don't understand the push-pull. And it's kind of like working out issues that you may have had in your childhood that you're doing subconsciously. You're trying to find that loving figure, but you're scared. And I think while we all have this set type that we are, life circumstances and things that happen, even as adults or teenagers, can kind of shift that temporarily and have us kind of moving in different directions, attracting different people. I thought for a very long time, when I learned about these different types, that I was anxious, because I kept attracting avoidant types and it would make me feel completely insane. And I didn't understand. And as I learned more, I realized, no, I'm actually a very kind of prototypical secure type. And these avoidants were very attracted to me. And in turn, if I happened to be with an anxious type, that actually worked very well. I was able to provide the support that an anxious type needed. And those kind of, whether they were short-term or long-term relationships, those actually worked well. I think it was a huge comfort for them. Whereas the avoidant type, while it can be worked through, they tend to be the hardest, the most challenging to date, really, for anybody. I think it's really interesting how we are attracted to the different people and the things that happen subconsciously. I know for me, secure has definitely been my happiest place. But I know that there's also, as a secure type, there's also kind of a maternal feeling that you get from dating an anxious type. It makes you feel good. You feel like you're caregiving. It's kind of, we kind of gloss over the secure type because it's like, man, you had an easy childhood. Things are good, blah, blah. You're emotionally stable. But I think we tend to attract really interesting types. And I think it's also interesting kind of the comfort that we get with other types. So just to interject that a little bit there.
Yeah, I like what you said, Lauren, and I totally agree with you that most people are attracted to partners that they know unconsciously are going to teach them something that they need to learn.
Definitely.
Right?
Yes.
And that can be very frustrating sometimes because those lessons can be painful and difficult, but we are constantly choosing partners who teach us things that we need to know and that we need to work out. I'm not really sure what type of attachment style I am. I've never really taken a test. I would think that I'm probably a secure type, but I also notice myself at times having anxious tendencies or even avoidant tendencies. And so I think that different people or different situations can sometimes even bring out different responses from you. They can trigger different responses in you. And it's really interesting when that happens.
Well, that's actually what ends up happening. It's like you do have your attachment style, but they can be kind of adjusted based on the different relationships. The relationship that I had with the guy from last year, we're going to call him Mr. Big, everybody. So, he was actually very avoidant. but he was the weird subset, that 5% that's like anxious avoidant. And so what happens is that certain people, they start out as anxious types, and then they get screwed over so much that they become avoidant types. And so now they're it's even more conflicting for them, because sometimes like really disconnected emotional people will fall into the avoidant side, and there's just a really big wall. But the anxious avoidant knows the value in relationship and they want to get closer, but then they run away. But for me, because I was treated with kindness, and because I think that he opened himself up a lot more than he had previously, I really, I think, had an impression on him, and it like really resonated with him. I think that it allowed us both to move a little bit further beyond those barriers. I mean, it's kind of a silly thing because it didn't work out and it didn't work, but in a lot of ways it healed me, if that makes sense, because there was such decency. And like the other guys that I had dated, they had been such monsters and just so difficult. I mean, one of them broke into my house, for Christ's sake, So when I was treated okay, it kind of made it more okay to get close to somebody, if that makes sense, at least in my case.
Oh no, it definitely does. I mean, it's confirmation that there is that love out there, that there is somebody you can connect with out there. And I think, watching it from a kind of secondhand view, you did recognize that almost immediately with him. And there is a big difference, I think, from having dated different types of avoidant personalities. There's a very big difference between kind of anxious avoidant, and I believe it is the dismissive avoidant. I'm not sure if that's the fourth category. And it's not that they're terrible people. It's not that, they're not capable of love. It's just, it's scarier for them. I think in their minds, they likely have a lot more to lose, whether that's true or not. And it puts whoever they do love or they're interested in a bit of a disadvantage, because you're pushed in that anxious direction and you're constantly trying to prove yourself. So that can be challenging too. And I do think it's so fascinating how we all find each other. And like Stephanie said earlier, the kind of that subconscious need to learn and to get experiences from people that we're with, that we love, that we date, that we care about. I think it's really interesting how we find each other and what we take from each situation. And if it's possible to change, if it's possible to move from an anxious to a secure, or from a, anxious avoidant to a secure, or even avoidant to an anxious secure, how that really works.
Yeah, I think also society influences that, right? I don't think it's particularly helpful. I touched on this before, but the avoidant is almost societally approved of, because we're in this situation now where, I don't know, love isn't as much of a priority for people. I think that's not really the impression that people are trying to put out there. So I think that further complicates it. It's unfortunate, because it's like, how are you ever going to connect with somebody if you can't be honest and open with them? And especially with things like, all these dating apps and stuff, people become very disposable.
I agree. And it's also, I mean, there's been a lot of studies taking it a lot further to orphanages, especially in Eastern Europe. I know there's been a lot of studies on Romanian and Russian orphanages, and how these children are not given any attention or any love or affection. And they end up with far worse things than just being an avoidant in love. They end up with oppositional defiance disorder, and some of them are very pathological. And it can go in a really extreme way if it's something that's not really worked out early, or people are not shown love early. And I think it's just kind of fascinating, the psychology of that.
Yeah, so I would like to give our listeners, in case they're wondering, well, what am I? What is my attachment style? I'd like to give our listeners a little bit of a quiz that they can use to determine maybe what they are, and then use that as a trailhead to explore later. So,
awesome. Cool.
Yeah, so this is coming from Wikipedia. And if you have a secure attachment style, you might tend to agree with these phrases or statements. It's relatively easy for me to become emotionally close to others. I'm comfortable depending on others and also having others depend on me. I don't worry about being alone or about others not accepting me. And this style of attachment usually results from a history of warm and responsive interactions with their caregivers. Securely attached people tend to have positive views of themselves and their attachments, and also positive views of relationships. So,
Lucky bastards.
yeah, this all sounds great so far, right? Now they're listing some of the insecure attachment styles. So there's anxious preoccupied. People with anxious preoccupied attachment styles tend to agree with these statements. I want to be completely emotionally intimate with others, but I often find that others are reluctant to get as close as I would like. And also, I'm uncomfortable being without close relationships, but I sometimes worry that others don't value me as much as I value them. People with this style of attachment seek high levels of intimacy, approval, and responsiveness from their attachment figure. Sometimes they value intimacy to such an extent that they become overly dependent on the attachment figure. And compared to securely attached people, people who are anxious or preoccupied with attachment tend to have less positive views about themselves. And then there's two styles of avoidant. There's the dismissive avoidant and the fearful avoidant.
Right. The fearful avoidant is the one that's kind of like anxious avoidant. That's the weird 5% that Mr. Big fell into. I think. I don't know. But
yeah, okay.
Anyway, but go over the avoidant one, because that one's the big enchilada. A lot of people are probably going to find themselves, especially I think like a lot of crypto people and tech people are more avoidant. So that's why they're good at their jobs, but not in the job of love, people.
Right. Well, that's why we're doing our show here.
All right.
Yeah.
Cool.
And you might be listening to this too and think, oh, maybe this doesn't apply to me, but this definitely applies to a past partner I had or a current partner or something like that. So maybe you can help that way. All right. So the style of dismissive avoidant, they might tend to agree with the following statements. I am comfortable without close emotional relationships. So happy being alone. It is important to me to feel independent and self-sufficient. And I prefer not to depend on others or have others depend on me. People with this attachment style desire a high level of independence. The desire for independence often appears as an attempt to avoid attachment altogether. They view themselves as self-sufficient and invulnerable to feelings associated with being closely attached to others. They often deny even needing close relationships. Some may view close relationships as unimportant. Not surprisingly, they seek less intimacy with attachments, whom they often view less positively than they view themselves. So they're kind of like discarding their partners. They're almost like throwing them away. And then finally, the fearful avoidant style, which is another subtype of avoidant. The Wikipedia says this can often be people who have a history of trauma, such as sexual abuse or a loss in their childhood or abandonment in their childhood or adolescence. And they can tend to agree with these statements. I am somewhat uncomfortable getting close to others. I want emotionally close relationships, but I find it difficult to completely trust others or to depend on them. I sometimes worry that I will be hurt if I allow myself to become too close to other people. Now, I think we all know someone like this, right?
Yeah.
They tend to feel uncomfortable with emotional closeness, and the mixed feelings are combined with sometimes unconscious negative views about themselves and their attachments. They sometimes view themselves as unworthy of responsiveness from their attachments, and they don't trust the intentions of their attachments. So they're always second guessing. They have a lot of trouble trusting. And then this makes sense if someone has a history of trauma or loss or abandonment or something like that. They want closeness on one hand, but they also find it really difficult to trust. So was that helpful in sorting out what are the different attachment styles?
I think it's helpful, but I think it's kind of overwhelming for people if you fall into one of the quote unquote bad categories, right? I mean, it's like, oh, great, I'm a mess. Now what?
Yeah, I mean, I think self-awareness is the first step, right? So you understand where you're at, you accept where you're at, and then maybe you see if you want to change it, right? But before you can change it, you have to say, yeah, this is just me. This is my history has made me who I am today. And maybe there's something I can do to heal myself. Maybe I need some attention. Maybe I need to read about this a little bit more. Maybe I need to do, work with a therapist or just do exercises on my own that are going to help me feel more secure.
I actually have a friend of mine that learned about this. And so she considers herself avoidant, right? And so she's dating this guy in her building, and he was also avoidant.
Mhm.
And because she learned about her avoidant ways, she could recognize those patterns in him. And it's resulted in them actually having a really good relationship. But it took forever, and it took a bunch of emotional beatings. So she would say to him, she would try and talk to him about the relationship. He would literally run out of the room and say, I don't know what you're offering me, but I don't want any of it. And like run out like a crazy person.
Wow.
Can't even say anything. Yeah. And so it's really hard when you're dealing with an avoidant, because you have to be prepared for that no means yes, which is completely opposite of what we're being taught now.
Yeah.
You know, Mr. Big and I are still in contact, and it's a constant form of frustration because, you know, he'll tell me, I don't want to be with you. We can't be friends. I don't like, the only way we can hang out is if you're with somebody else and you're madly in love, as if I'd want to hang out with him if I was madly in love with somebody else. You know, so like what they say and what they do are completely different things.
He says that, but then his actions say something different because he's contacting you and stuff like that.
Exactly. Like, why
Mm.
come to my gig if you know I'm going to sing love songs about you if you don't want to talk to me? It makes no sense. Right. And
Right.
that's really, really hard, especially on an anxious person, because you can't, you know, it almost fulfills those weird fears that you have. And then it also fulfills the fantasies that you have.
Mm.
And so I think it could be really dangerous. I think in the case of my friend and her neighbor, there may be the exception to the rule, but that insight definitely helped her adjust. I think if this guy was more willing to really engage with his own emotions consistently, I think that there would be, I mean, look, I'm still in love with him. There's no doubt about that. But I mean, I'm trying to move on with my life because I can't take the beatings anymore, and I deserve more than that. So there's only so many times you can knock on that door, but it definitely happens. So if you're one of those girls that's dating a guy and you think that he likes you, but then he treats you like garbage, he probably does like you, but it doesn't mean he's going to stop treating you like garbage. So,
Mm.
you know, we kind of have to find those places where you can say enough is enough. And I think it's maybe unhealthy. Whenever I hear about my friend and her neighbor, I think it's unhealthy for me because it gives me this false belief that maybe I can change things. And
Mm.
it's really difficult to know, where is that line? How do I stop my heart? You know, because I mean, in my case, I'm like a mess, right? I'm like super engaged, and, you know, it's good for songwriting, but it's not necessarily good for productivity. It's not good for me just being a normal member of society. So I don't know. What do
Yeah.
you guys think is that line there, right?
I appreciate you sharing that, Tatiana, because I know that there's going to be a lot of people in the audience who can really relate to that. You know, it can be really emotionally risky and dangerous for a person who has an avoidant style to fall in love with a person who has an anxious style to fall in love with an avoidant, because there is this dynamic that keeps being set up where on the one hand, it's kind of familiar to the anxious person, right? They expect the person that is their caregiver or the object of their affection to turn away from them. But also they want it to be different. You know, you were saying it's fulfilling both your fears and also your fantasies, right? Because the fear is that they're going to turn away, but also in one way that's kind of familiar. So it's like you kind of are drawn to that, or you seek it out because you've experienced it before. But the fantasy is that they're not going to turn away. They're going to actually finally give you that love that you're looking for. And you keep hanging on because you're hoping that will happen at some point. And it's hard for them. It's hard for the avoidant person because maybe parts of them want to give you that love, but then other parts are really holding them back and protecting them from getting too deep in and getting too vulnerable.
Yeah, I think it's actually very scary for that person as well. I mean, I sense a lot of fear when I speak to him, and I
Mm.
feel like he doesn't even know what his feelings are. I
Yeah.
don't think that in this case, I've dated a lot of MFers out there, but in this guy's case, I don't think that he's trying to be evil at all. I think he's just really not in touch with his feelings, which is unfortunate, because you really need bravery and you need to have that risk. So I don't know, even though I'm like the more pathetic of the two, I guess,
also the more likely to find genuine love because I'm not afraid to do that. So I might get beaten along the way, but at least it's open. It gets a little bit harder when you're avoidant. Not impossible, especially if you meet somebody who's patient and who's willing to go on that journey with you, because it's not something. That was another thing that he was like, oh, I'm going to fix this on my own. And it's like, well, no, you can't fix attachment by yourself, because then you don't ever get to be outside of that comfort zone.
I agree. And I want to add, as somebody who's also dated quite a few avoidant types, probably the anxious and the fearful. I think one of the things that makes it hard for other types, no matter what your type is that these avoidant types that do really want to give more but don't know how, or they have that fear, those tend to be the types in the dating situations who keep coming around. They come around for years. You'll think that they're back and you'll try to make it work, and they'll shut down again. And then 6 months later, they return. A year later, they return. I've had exes from years back who I know couldn't give me anything that I needed. They know that quite as well, but it's scary for them almost to let go just as much as it is to give in and open up. So that's something also, I think, just from a shared dating perspective, that we have to kind of recognize and look at within ourselves. Like for you, Tatiana, you've reached that kind of breaking point where you see that. And it's, am I willing to take this anymore? Am I going off on my own to find something that can make me consistently happy and that can give me what I deserve? That's a really hard thing for a lot of people. And I see people in that kind of push-pull situation for decades. I mean, I don't think that that's really that uncommon. So that's something to keep an eye on also, because, as friends and as loved ones, we want to support the people we love. And when we see from an outside perspective an avoidant type coming back into our friends' lives, of course, the immediate response is, well, yes, they still want you. Let's give it another chance. You should try to work on it. But when it gets to that point where it's been years that you're spending on somebody that's avoidant, when do you have that breaking point? When do you decide, I can't do this anymore? It needs to be about me. So I think that's also an interesting thing to kind of explore.
I wanted to wrap up the show by talking about giving people a little bit of hope. Like, what can you do about this? If you become aware that you have tendencies to seek out love from other people and your needs are not getting met, perhaps you have an anxious style or an avoidant style, or even a secure style with tendencies to express anxious or avoidant characteristics sometimes. What can you actually do about it? And
that's a good question.
Yeah. And I think the answer is there's absolutely something you can do about it. Even if you didn't get the love, even if you didn't get the ideal childhood or the ideal amount of love or type of love from your parents or caregivers when you were growing up, you can always give love to yourself as an adult. And that's the answer to this, is self-love. Working on finding those hurt inner children or those past selves within us that are hurting from something that happened in our past, and then going back to them and really listening to how they feel and giving them love, almost as if it's a child that you're interacting with, that you are then becoming their parent. And you're going to become their reparent, and you're going to become the ideal parent that they maybe never had. And so through working with yourself in this way, giving your past selves and your inner children love, you can begin to feel more secure. And you realize that you don't need to depend on other people to give you love or to take care of your hurt inner children. You can actually do that yourself as their primary caregiver. And any relationship that you're in, they're going to be a secondary caregiver.
Well, that actually is touched on a book that you gave me called "You Are the One" by Richard Schwartz. Is that his name?
Yeah, Richard Schwartz is someone who developed the IFS, or Internal Family Systems model of therapy. And this is something that I've been really interested in and found really helpful. And this is this idea that we all have different parts within us. And then some of those parts are, like I was just talking about, hurt inner children that need to be loved and need to be cared for. And you can talk to them, these parts of yourself, as though they are a child who's just sitting next to you. And you can send them lots and lots of love and reintegrate them back within yourself to heal. So yeah, the book is called You Are the One You've Been Waiting For in Relationships, I think something like that. And it is all about how this model of therapy applies to intimate relationships. Definitely recommend checking that out.
I think we can get into that a little bit more in depth on another episode, because when I hear about talking to my inner children, I think, get your psychobabble out of here.
Yes,
But,
I think a lot of people think that, right? Like,
right?
oh, get out of here. I don't have inner children.
Yeah, it's kind of like weird to kind of picture that. Another couple things. There's this lady, Tracy Crossley. I really like her podcast. The book that really woke me up was called Attached.
Mm.
And that's available on Amazon. We'll include some links maybe to some of this stuff. That would be cool.
I've read that as well. I second that book. I think it's a fantastic kind of introduction.
Yeah, Attached. And look, you guys aren't going to fix yourselves. You're not broken. You know what I mean? First of all, you're not like a
Not
complete
broken.
disaster. There's lots of people that have these problems, but don't think that it's something that's going to happen in a couple of days, and then all of a sudden you're going to be perfect in all of your relationships and you'll have no insecurities whatsoever. I mean, that stuff comes up even for people who have thought about this stuff. It's an ongoing process, and that's why, I like to focus the show on self-love, because, when somebody says you should love yourself, it sounds like an accusation.
Mm-hmm.
But don't look at it that way. Look at it as a way to be gentle to yourself and read about these things and gain a little bit of compassion for yourself. Sometimes when I look at the way that I've behaved, I'm always like, oh, I'm such a pathetic loser. Like, that's not a good way to talk to yourself. You wouldn't talk like that to your friend.
Yes.
And I hear my friends saying that to themselves too. And it doesn't mean you're stupid. It just means that you need to make an adjustment to your patterns a little bit.
I was just thinking, yeah, most of us talk to ourselves in a way that we wouldn't even speak to our best friend. And so we need to think about that a little bit and think, oh, is this really helping? And it's actually a very empowering thing to realize that you can give yourself love. It's not like a thing that you should be ashamed of, that, oh, you should be loving yourself more. Why don't you? Right?
Exactly. I always feel when somebody says that to me, I find it very offensive. It's like, how dare you make a judgment about how my relationship is with myself?
Yeah.
I think it's a really annoying piece of advice, because it doesn't actually make someone love themselves more. But when you kind of come to that conclusion on your own, I think that's where the real growth comes in.
Right, because then you don't have to rely on someone else. You don't have to wait around and wait for someone else to give you love. You can start on it right now and start giving it to yourself. And so it's hard to, in a podcast, just give like a blanket statement that says, this is how you love yourself. It's going to be different for everybody, right? But maybe you could start reading about that a little bit. Maybe you could read
an example of love, right? I mean, listening to this show is a way that you're investing that time into thinking about these things. It's not like you have to sit there and do like a recipe. I mean, just thinking about it alone will ripple out through the rest of your day. You're going to think about this stuff, and it's like, you can't just look over a little seed and just watch it and say, when are you going to be a big tree? You got to give it a little bit of time, I think.
Yes, I like that. And absolutely, let's give themselves a pat on the back just for listening to our show. You are loving yourself more.
I like that.
I do too.
All right. Should we wrap up there?
I think so. If you guys are digging this show, tell your friends about it. We're online. We're at a Proof of Love Cast is our Twitter handle. We're building out of our social media. So go and check on proofoflovecast.com and tell your friends, listen in. And this is also hopefully a good way for you to connect with somebody that you have a relationship with. If you're in a relationship and you guys have a hard time communicating, maybe listening to this show will allow you to open up and have some of those conversations. And if you're being a crazy anxious person, don't worry, you're not crazy. 25% of the world is just as nuts as you. So,
Yes.
that's okay. And if you're avoidant, it doesn't mean that you're going to have to be alone forever. You can do things incrementally and hopefully find a partner who's patient and able to work with you and understand where you're at.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we accept you, and hopefully you accept yourself no matter where you're at. And we'd love to hear your feedback on this show at proofoflovecast.com. You can send us a message through our contact form if you have any feedback, or if you have any suggestions or questions for a future show.
Yeah, I'd love it if people have advice questions that they need advice about, or if they have subject topics, or if they want to be a guest on the show, definitely write us.
All right. Well, thanks so much for listening. This has been Proof of Love.
Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Show me your heart. 'cause I need some